In this video, I just want to present a little bit of background content on the concept of power. If we think about these tools of being savvy in political organizations, we spent a lot of time in class talking about social networks and social capital. And when we come back together in a week and a half, we're going to spend a little time starting just to talk a bit about influence tactics. And power is an important background concept before we talk about influence. So if we think about what is power, the vital part of this definition is that power involves the potential to influence. So influence is sort of the activity or the effort that's put into changing the behavior of other people. And one source of influence is power. We're going to talk about a variety of other influence tactics, some of which rely on power and some don't. But it's really an important thing to think about power as one place that you can draw to influence others. So if we think about power as this potential, and that's really the important thing to think about, that power really does nothing for us unless we activate it. So we have to do something to make power be effective. But it's also, I think, really important to think through who is powerful. And in terms of elevating your savvy, to be better at detecting where power is in organizations. So I would recommend that you just pause the video here for a moment and reflect on these questions. So first of all, think a little bit about who is powerful in your organization. Who are the people and who are the groups? Which are the groups that are powerful? Some organizations, marketing holds the power. Some organizations, finance holds the power. Some organizations, engineering or design holds the power. So are there groups that you feel have more power? If that's true, or are there individuals who have more power or less power? What's the evidence? How do you know that? Think a little bit about, how do you know? Probably some of it is just unconscious and you don't think very much about it. You just kind of know. Sometimes there's indicators of power, who speaks more in meetings, who can call meetings, whose opinion seems to hold more weight or change the direction of decisions more than others. Those are all indicators. Also, think a little bit about which differences in behavior. So do people who have power behave differently than those who don't? Sometimes one signal is people who are able to be late to meetings, for example, and not suffer any punishment from that behavior. It might be an indication that they're powerful. It's not nice if they abuse that power, but sometimes that's just sort of a natural thing that seems to happen. So pause for a moment, look at the screen, jot down a few things, because that's going to be an important thing to think about, how able you are to detect power and maybe avoid some of those underpowered situations we learned about in Survival of the Savvy. Okay, so hopefully you thought through a little bit about who has power, what do you think the indicators of power are, and what if any, behavioral differences are there between people who have power and don't. Now, there may be fewer if you have an organization culture that's more egalitarian or isn't really very status focused, or there may be more obvious ones if you have an organization that has really strong power indicators and lots of status differences. So you can think through maybe a little bit about why those things are different. If you've had jobs in more than one organization, you can think a little bit about were the indicators different and why. But here are a couple things you can think about when you try to assess power, right? One is by reputation. People will tell you, right? They might say, watch out for so-and-so, or this person's, their word is going to hold weight, and it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. So some of it is who people say has power. So, a little of that you can do detective-wise, asking around. However, sometimes you have to be careful about who you ask, because that can get back to people in power and they may be suspicious about why you want to know that information. So this is where you want your trusted network, people you can ask those questions. They have your back, they'll help you out so you don't sort of wander into a landmine, not knowing that you are speaking truth to power and getting yourself into some kind of trouble if you're unaware. Another is these representational indicators, right? So if you think about which functional group or area has the most power, well, how many board seats or top management team seats are coming from one particular function or another? Do people need to go through global to get to senior level executive positions? Some of that is the representation you see. What are the numbers you see? What are the kinds of people who end up in power? And what are their characteristics? That can help you know something about who has power and maybe who gets power in your organization. Some of it's looking at consequences, right? So if there are hard decisions being made, who seems to gain and who seems to lose on a regular basis? That's some trace of where the power is in an organization. And then, of course, there can be symbols or perks out there. And again, this will vary depending upon your culture. Some cultures are all about status, and there's really hard indicators that show who has power and who doesn't have power. Key offices, having an office versus a cubicle, getting other kinds of perks, who can work from home and work from a distance, who makes their own hours. A lot of those things oftentimes are associated with or indicators of power. But just thinking through all this helps you be a better detective and avoid some of those unanticipated problems if you aren't sure who's in power, and if you maybe otherwise would inadvertently say something that might offend a person in power or threaten power. It's important to think through some of these indicators of power. So a couple final things here, though, if you think about what the indicators are, it's also important to think through, where does power come from, both for yourself and others. There's a variety of different ways to think about this. And one set of this comes from, one set looks at looking at personal indicators of power. So, one kind of source of power are personal characteristics. So we do have research, and this kind of closely aligns with emergent leaders, sort of who just naturally shows up as leaders. We do see that people who tend to have a lot of high energy, or at least sort of display energy, and have a fair amount of physical stamina, tend to have more power. People who are able to focus and illustrate focus can have more power. To some degree, sensitivity to others. That doesn't mean that you're actually kind, because there can be people who are powerful who are abusive or bullying. But I think these people kind of understand what other people are looking for and how they can sway other people. So that sensitivity is associated with power. To some degree, on the positive side, people who tend to have good relationships tend to be more powerful. And we'll come back to that when we think about the idea of liking in influence tactics. Back to survival of the savvy, to some degree, the power of ideas can provide power. Obviously, having a reputation as effective can offer the idea of the power of ideas. But again, that usually is not enough. It needs to oftentimes be in concert somehow with the power of the person, which has to do somewhat with this idea of characteristics. And then, of course, I hope we all would recognize that where you are in the network, being central and being a broker sitting between structural holes, right, different groups, that also affords power. So one other framework to help us think about what are the sources of power that we can draw on in organizations, and I hope can illustrate that we often have a lot more power than we may recognize. And part of that is that one source of power is so-called legitimate power or position power. And this power is coming from your role. And the thing that I think is a big challenge is sometimes we associate power with this authority that's connected to title or position. And of course, that is a source of power, but it is only a very limited source of power, and it only can apply in that limited domain where people accept and agree that you have authority. And another important thing about legitimate or authority or position power is it's actually one of the least effective to try to use to influence others. So basically saying, do it because I'm your boss, because I'm your boss and I say so, right? If you think about someone telling you to do something for that reason, you may do that. You may actually conduct the work, but you're probably not going to be very motivated to work very hard or do anything extra if that's the only way that someone's trying to influence your behavior. So legitimate power or position power or authority is absolutely one source of power, but it's a fairly limited source of power and limited in its capability to influence others. So I should just point out that this is a framework developed by French and Raven that's been around since I think at least the 50s. That is a really good way to kind of characterize where power comes from and the different sources of power we have. So a second source of power or base of power is reward or punishment power, right? So to some degree we can, if we have control over rewards that people want, then that gives us power because we can give those rewards or we can withhold those rewards. If we have punishment power, if we have the capability to fire someone or decide that they're not going to get some kind of a promotion or a bonus, that's in effect punishment. So that sort of power is another resource. What's important to notice here, though, is that oftentimes people get this kind of mixed up with position power, because there are certainly aspects of giving rewards or punishment that are associated with authority or your position, but in fact, we can give all sorts of rewards and punishment, frankly, apart from having any authority. And one really important way to think about that is just linking back to our feedback lecture, where if we give reinforcing feedback, recognition, positive feedback, if we do that publicly in meetings to people, those are forms of rewards. And if we're giving those out, that is building power for us. So if we do this regularly, we will build power. And again, part of that's referent power, kind of becoming more likable, but also it's this idea that you have control over giving people a wide variety of rewards, many of which are informal forms of recognition. And they are not connected to having a position of power or authority. Information is power, right? This is oftentimes what we see, but this is also very closely linked to our social network position, right? So if we're sitting in these, structural hold positions, like my little drawing happening, right? If we're this person in the middle of multiple networks, we are controlling the flow of information. So this is again where being sophisticated about your position in the network and actively working to build your network out to distinct groups in your organization and outside will increase your power because you will have more control over information. That's just one way that this works. And then finally, these last two are considered more, actually these all three are sort of considered person power more than position power. My drawing and writing isn't so great with this tool. But person power, first is referent power. This is power because people like you or they want to be like you. Sometimes people talk about charisma as well. So people who just sort of exude that energy and an enthusiasm that people want to follow and they're just attracted to. Some people are just more attractive, and I don't mean just physically. They're just attractive in terms of the energy that they put out there and the ideas that they come with. It's also coming from respect, right? People who are consistent, people who are measured, people who are fair are going to be respected, and all of that is going to bundle up into this referent power. People want to be reflected and connected to that, and so they will align themselves with people that are likable and admirable. And then finally, expert power. This kind of goes again back to the survival of the savvy, which is focusing on the idea that knowledge and expertise and ideas and execution all are sources of power. But oftentimes, in and of themselves, they're not going to be enough. I mean, we do have to develop this kind of sophistication around understanding influence and understanding the kind of political part of organizations and exercising some of that personal power in addition to the power of ideas. But altogether, French and Raven's work just says just like our networks, we should be thinking about these bases of power. And we should recognize that oftentimes we have more power than we are aware of. If we are simply thinking of power being aligned with position and authority, we're limiting our understanding of our capability to influence because we have these other areas we can draw upon. We can also work on developing this, right? We can work on giving more recognition, and therefore we're kind of using reward power. But if we do that, we're also building likability and referent power. So they go together and they bundle up, and together they can allow and afford us more opportunity to influence others if we think about building from multiple bases of power. So as a takeaway from this video, there's a couple other principles of power that we should be keeping in mind to elevate our capability to influence others in organizations. The first here is that power is neutral. You know, just like we talked about politics, sometimes people get a little queasy thinking about power and they feel uncomfortable thinking or expressing that they want power and that they want to raise and increase their power. Power in and of itself is neutral. It's only how you're applying it where the value, where the implications of power come from, right? So it's whether you're using this for organizationally legitimate means and at the same time, you know, developing your reputation and advancing your career because you're effective toward the organization's goals. Those are all positive, good reasons to use power. Now, we have those overly political people who are engaging in this because maybe they are narcissists, maybe they have kind of self-aggrandizement in mind, and they're willing to hurt people and hurt the organization to get there. Then it's not positive and it's not neutral, then it's negative. It's a part of life, and we all have to understand this is going on in organizations. Organizations are political places. People don't have the same goals and reasons for participating, and so we need to elevate our sense of savvy to become more effective leaders in organizations. So in addition to being neutral, the other things to think about here are the idea that power is latent and it's contextual. So what do we mean when I say power is latent? Okay, well, it means that until you activate it, I said that at the very beginning of this video, until you do something to try to exercise your power, it doesn't help you. So, you know, just being the boss, people may not listen to you. Just because you're sitting there in that position of authority, you may have very little influence because you have to demonstrate or invoke your position to try to get people to do something. But again, it's limiting if you think about only drawing on position power. So drawing on being liked might be a way to get people to do things you want them to do, which is a good bridge to the idea of influence tactics, which we will talk about when we come back in class. Influence is taking our power and moving it into action. The final thing to think about or keep in mind when you think about power is that it's contextual. And what this means is that it only works in the context that it's developed and recognized. So, for example, authority. I might have position power being a professor because I have the power and authority to evaluate you and give you grades. But if we met outside of the context of school and the university and we found ourselves working together on a board, you know, it's less likely that my role as your professor is going to get you to do things. You know, again, maybe because maybe if you have some concern that your behavior in a different domain could affect my decision making about you in the domain of the university, yeah, maybe there's some influence there because maybe that reward and coercive power would carry across the contexts. But let's just say outside of class, once we've finished this class and we meet up again on a board, the fact that I have this authority role is very unlikely to really get you to do something. More likely is going to come from those other bases of power. Also, you know, structure of the organization is limiting. Sometimes you will not have much capability to get action to happen in one part of the organization. If you aren't known there, if you don't have a reputation there, for example. Culture will matter. Cultures vary a great deal in terms of what kind of power carries weight. And if you leave one organization, go to another, and don't recognize that, what kind of worked in one place doesn't work here, you can actually damage your reputation and undermine your power. And then finally, outside the organization itself, right? Like what is known, what is sort of respected, what is sort of understood. Is that going to carry across those different contexts? So it's important to think about cultivating your bases of power and thinking about your social network and its capability for you to influence others, both in your current role and in your future role and in roles outside of the workplace. And that will help you become more savvy in terms of overall capability of developing and exercising influence.